Movies have always been about telling a story, taking the viewer on a journey to the unknown. The genre best known for that is fantasy. Just look at the fantasy books, fairy tales. Movies have used the imagination of its audiences to transport them to another realm. Fantasy and cinema began during the humble beginnings of the industry and grew into the genre that not only shaped modern pop culture, but also revolutionized the film industry as a whole. One of the first fantasy movies so happens to also be one of the first narrative films ever created, Georges Méliès' A Trip to the Moon, a film that was groundbreaking for its day, not only in its story, but special effects as well, from the characters shooting themselves onto the moon to the detailed sets of the large mushroom forest at the center of the moon. The film played on the imagination of its viewers and future filmmakers alike. Another film that came out in the early days of cinema that changed our imaginations was William H. O'Brien's King Kong. O'Brien was the father of claymation. His works would take viewers to the mysterious Skull Island to see creatures unknown to mankind. A great example of the transporting power that film has would be 1939's classic The Wizard of Oz. With its use of color, it took viewers to a new realm using bright sets and costumes. Top that with effects such as the magic from the scary Wicked Witch of the West and her flying evil monkeys. People were blown away by the magical land of Oz. By the 1950s and 60s, fantasy films had fallen into a B rating. Like most great things in Hollywood, once they find something that works, it becomes overused for quick cash. Not to sound unimpressed by the special effects brought by George Pal and Ray Harryhausen, which for its day pushed technology, with great films such as 1953's War of the Worlds, which helped inspire sci-fi, come to the more cult classic films like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms or The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao. During the same time period, fantasy films began to shift focus from sci-fi and original tales to more commonly known fairy tales and myths, with Disney classics such as Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty based both on French and Brothers Grimm's tales to the swashbuckling actions of Middle Eastern folklore with The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which spawned two B-rated sequels in the 1970s. During the 60s, fantasy became a cult genre. Only those willing to watch B-movies enjoyed the genre. The year is 1977. A young director had just created a film where he put all his eggs in one basket, so to say. Production was far from smooth. Everyone on set thought the film was going to be B-rated. Opening weekend, though, proved it was far from a B flick. That film was Star Wars. Star Wars was a film that helped save the fantasy genre. It told the story of a heroic adventure in another land, something the original fantasy epics did. What set Star Wars apart was its use of state-of-the-art special effects, with the use of miniatures and animatronics paired with spot-on sound effects, which made the film seem so real, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. After the booming success of Star Wars, Hollywood had become more open to films of high fantasy. One film that rode that wave was Conan the Barbarian. Conan was a new breed of fantasy, one that used high action, bloody violence paired with sex to create a fantasy for adults. With success in Hollywood comes those who want to join the bandwagon. Extreme B-rated films like Deathstalker, The Blade Master, or Barbarian Queens. All of those films would take what was good about Conan and lower the genre back into the realm of bad movies. During the same time frame as Conan, another fantasy epic was born. It was brought to life by the wonderful work of Jim Henson, Dark Crystal. The film was dark, and quite honestly scary to a lot of children. Labyrinth was another great film that was darker in nature than most other children's films. Both films utilized amazing puppetry to create otherworldly creatures that would amaze yet haunt our dreams. Fantasy began to shift. There was only B-rated Conan copies and the fantasy epics of Jim Henson, which brought a shift of the market to children. Dark Crystal and Labyrinth brought darker fantasy to a new generation that would pave the way for the genre in the 90s. The fantasy genre was at a standstill sorts during the late 80s through the 90s. The market had shifted to children's movies with Disney classics such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and Hercules. One standout filmmaker brought fantasy to an older and broader audience. That was Tim Burton. Burton's early films brought dark comedy with a fantasy twist, with films such as Beetlejuice, which dealt with a crazy look into the afterlife, brought to life with claymation effects to bring us a scary yet funny look into Limbo. Not long after that film, Burton took on superhero films, bringing his dark fantasy themes to Batman to create a unique vision of that hero, which stuck for years. By the mid-90s, technology began to boom in the film industry. In 1993, the Steven Spielberg mega hit Jurassic Park paved way for the use of CGI, which was used in the overall okay film Dragonheart. Dragonheart was a fantasy drama that used the first ever completely computer-generated dragon in cinema history. By the late 90s, fantasy was very much still a children's genre, but one film series would bring that wall down. That is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, based on the epic fantasy book series by the legendary J.R.R. Tolkien. How did Peter Jackson do it, one might ask? The same way all of the other fantasy greats did before him. Rewrite the rules. Using techniques from those before, Jackson worked with the Weta Workshop to create every single prop seen in the film from scratch, along with miniatures crafted with perfection and the use of groundbreaking CGI for its epic battles and award-winning animation of the fully CGI character Gollum. The Lord of the Rings did so much more than just effects. It was paired with a masterclass story about a nobody coming together with a ragtag band of adventurers that create a friendship to save the world. While it might sound like a lot of movies, this movie came out at a time when people needed it. It was December of 2001, just a few months after the tragedy of 9/11. This film helped bring people together and escape the world they were living in, bringing some relief from their normal day-to-day lives. Like all great things, you can bet Hollywood would try and capitalize on it. After The Lord of the Rings came a plethora of fantasy book adaptations. While some were great, like the Harry Potter series, others not so much. For years, theaters were flooded with films that felt rushed, trying to capitalize on the market, such as Hunger Games, Twilight, Divergent, and Eragon. Though not all that came after The Lord of the Rings was bad, the film normalized fantasy again, bringing the genre back into pop culture. Hollywood also tried this with The Lord of the Rings, with the creation of the Hobbit trilogy, but failed to do so. While the films themselves were far from bad, they just didn't have the same feel as the original trilogy. Yet those films did push movies with new technology, utilizing 48 frames per second to help the CG look better with the non-CG characters. Fantasy has always played a key role in the history of film, and will continue to do so. The genre has since taken over television with HBO's epic book adaptation, Game of Thrones. From there, we can expect it to grow and evolve into whatever the next step may be. People will always want an escape. For many, that escape is in film, and fantasy is a genre that has always provided that escape. While shaping the technology that we see in modern film today, it was all driven by those who wanted to create something otherworldly and help transport the audiences to lands unknown.